I want to thank everybody for joining us today. We really appreciate people taking the time out of your schedules. This particular webinar is about the SPIR II evaluation conducted by IFPRI under the IMPEL Associate Award. My name is Julia, and I work for Save the Children, and I currently support the IMPEL Associate Award. Before we get started, I want to kind of do a little bit of the agenda for the next hour. And you should, the first kind of initial part is introductions, then we're going to have the presentation, and then the final 15 minutes approximately will be question and answers that we will be taking from the Q&A box. So we welcome kind of input and thought in those questions. So with that, I'm going to hand this over to Arif Rashid, who does the coordination for the monitoring and evaluation function within DHR at the Department of State.
Thank you, Julia. Good morning, afternoon, or evening. As Julia noted, my name is Arif Rashid. I coordinate the monitoring and evaluation functions for the Bureau of Disaster and Humanitarian Assistance. Thank you for joining today's presentation on the results of the Strengthen PSNP Institutions and Resilience II project. This is a 5-year resilience food security project implemented by World Vision in partnership with CARE and ORDA Ethiopia. The project was implemented in the Amhara and Oromia regions of Ethiopia. SPIR II and the associated research were funded by USAID's Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance and implemented from 2021 through 26. The International Food Policy Research Institute led the SPIR II learning agenda and conducted the research to assess the effectiveness of different intervention packages. The findings from this work are extremely important to DHR, the implementing community, other donors, and the government of Ethiopia. SPIR II is both a resilience-focused Feed the Future resilience food security project and a key companion to Ethiopia's flagship Productive Safety Net program, a large-scale social protection program established in 2005 that targets the poorest households in Ethiopia. The results we will hear today will help DHR, implementers, and other stakeholders designing more effective projects and programs to improve food security, strengthen resilience, and reduce poverty. With that, I would like to invite Dr. Jessica Late and her team to present the findings. Over to you, Jessica. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining the call today. My name is Jessica Light. I'm a senior research fellow at IFPRI, and I'm going to be presenting findings from the IMPEL evaluation. This is joint work with a number of colleagues, Dan Gilligan, Kale Hironen, and Haileselassie from IFPRI, Hiwot Mekonnen-Misfin from World Bank Gender Innovation Lab, and Michael Morford, previously the Chief of Party for SPIR II and now at the Northwestern Global Poverty Research Lab. I'll be presenting the first half of the findings, and then I'll pass to Kale for the second half. Just to provide a short outline, I'll be describing the study background and design, the primary findings for nutrition and livelihood outcomes. Then we'll discuss some heterogeneity and cost-benefit analysis and conclusions and policy implications. And as noted in the introduction, this will be followed by Q&A. As background for this presentation, I'm sure the motivation is familiar to this audience. Social safety nets are now growing in use across sub-Saharan Africa, as well as around the world. And there's high interest from policymakers and funders in using these safety nets as platforms for broader objectives. And that includes achieving graduation from poverty over the longer term and reducing undernutrition, particularly for vulnerable populations, including children. Strengthen PSNP Institutions and Resilience, or SPIR II, aim to support the implementation of the Productive Safety Net Program, or PSNP, and enhance livelihoods, resilience, and nutritional outcomes for food insecure rural households in Ethiopia. And as noted in the introduction, this work was funded by the US government, was implemented with World Vision as the lead, supported by CARE and ORDA, and the target regions were Amhara and Oromia, joined by Tigray in the final years of implementation, but this evaluation was conducted only in the two regions here. Its years of implementation was from 2021 to 2026. We evaluated SPIR II using a 3-arm cluster randomized trial that was designed jointly with the implementers and stakeholders, and it included 3 key arms. In the first arm, the Productive Safety Net program was implemented with SPIR II support for provision of cash and food transfers. If you're not familiar with the underlying PSNP, it provides 6 months of transfers during the lean season, a mix of cash and food to support food security for extremely poor households. In the context of our trial, this serves as a control arm. They receive no supplementary or additional services from SPIR. In the second arm, households are exposed to core SPIR II programming in conjunction with nurturing care groups, or NCGs, that target enhanced infant and young child nutritional practices. And I'm going to describe all of these elements in more detail on the next slide, but core SPIR II programming centers around livelihoods interventions designed to enable households to identify new livelihoods activities, increase consumption, income, and resilience, and the nurturing care groups are designed to support appropriate feeding for infants and young children. And in the third arm, these same programming elements were supplemented by a targeted cash grant known as a maternal grant designed to provide additional resources for feeding of a young child. And it's important to note that many of the core programming elements here in ARMS 2 as well as ARM 3 have been implemented in previous VIFSA programming in Ethiopia over many years. So let me describe the interventions in more detail as well as the theory of change. Nurturing care groups are a form of peer-led behavioral change communication. So there are many different delivery mechanisms for behavioral change communication. In this case, nurturing care groups identify a peer who is trained in a cascading model to provide information around recommended infant and young child feeding practices to caregivers, normally mothers. The primary focus is IYCF, but there was also some supplemental material on related topics, health, sanitation, early child stimulation, etc. And the goal of providing this BCC is to better enable parents to address challenges related to undernutrition in their young children. Core SPIR graduation program centers around the use of the development of village economic and social associations, or VESAs. They're a platform for savings. They're used to increase financial literacy, enhance engagement in new livelihoods activities, and are broadly a platform for various forms of training. Maternal cash transfers, as I noted, implemented in T3 only for a value of $20 a month over a period of 24 months. And this was designed explicitly to relax financial constraints. So now that caregivers have more knowledge about recommended practice, they could use these resources to put that knowledge to use. And then the poorest 30% in ARMS 2 and 3 were targeted for livelihoods grant, which is a lump sum, one-time delivery, unlike the maternal cash transfer, which is delivered regularly. And the goal of the livelihoods grant is to build a productive asset base for sustained income generation. I should note, though, that both the maternal cash transfers and the livelihoods grants are unconditional once delivered. So they're labeled and there's training provided about their expected use. Then it's up to households to choose how to use them. We designed this evaluation by sampling around 3,000 PSNP households identified between August and September 2022 that met specific criteria. In addition to being eligible for the PSNP and served by SPIR, they had to have a pregnant woman present or a child under 9 months of age. And the reason for this is we wanted to identify a set of households with children all meeting the criteria of being in the key age for enhancing and measuring IYCF practices. We had a short run midline 1 year later, at which point these children would be aged 6 to 23 months. This is the primary round for measuring IYCF practices. It's also the ideal age at which to measure appropriate use of complementary feeding. At this point, All forms of SPIR programming, as well as maternal cash transfers, are ongoing. We conducted an N-line in spring 2025, at which point the children are aged 24 to 48 months. This is the primary round for measuring children's growth, their height and weight, and assessing whether the interventions were effective in reducing undernutrition. And at the point of N-line, some SPIR programming is ongoing, but the maternal cash transfer had ceased about 6 months earlier because its duration was only 24 months. We generally interviewed both the female respondent, the mother of the target child, and her spouse. Our empirical strategy is relatively straightforward given the randomized design. We are comparing outcomes in the treatment arm to outcomes in the control arm for, again, a cohort of children that are of approximately the same age and for their households, for their parents. We won't discuss attrition at length today, given very short time, but we did achieve a very low attrition rate with only about 4% of households lost to follow-up. So let me begin by describing the patterns of program exposure. So on the left, we have self-reported household participation in the village economic and savings groups at midline and at endline. We can see the vast majority of households in T2 and T3 targeted for SPIR II programming report participation, about 60 to 70% at midline, and that's risen to about 80% at endline. There's a small number of households in T1 reporting participation that presumably reflects a misunderstanding in which they're reporting participation in some other type of savings group. And on the right, receipt of the maternal cash transfer. As you recall, this was targeted to T3 only. And again, we see very high levels of participation in T3, about 90%. At N-line, we asked about past receipt because households would no longer be receiving the transfer, while virtually no households in T1 or T2 are receiving the transfer as intended. These are just a snapshot. We, of course, have many other variables capturing other dimensions of SPIR. In general, we observe very high fidelity of implementation across the board. Livelihoods grant receipt. Here, as I noted, only the poorest 33% of households in T2 and T3 were targeted for grants. So we now have 4 subgroups, T2 and T3 grant, meaning those poor households eligible for grants, and the no grant households, as well as the control. And again, we see very high fidelity of implementation with almost 100% of targeted households self-reporting they received a grant. And we will continue to present later in the presentation some findings differentiating outcomes with respect to the grant and no grant households. Let me begin now by providing nutrition findings. As noted, one of the primary goals of the nurturing care groups was to enhance maternal knowledge of infant and young child feeding practices. We measured this knowledge by administering parents, mothers, a short test of IYCF knowledge as part of our survey. We can see here that we do see positive effects on knowledge over time in both T2 and T3. That's the red and brown lines relative to T1, which is the blue line beneath. And the coefficients reported correspond to the treatment effects, TE2 being the difference between T2 and control, TE3 being the difference between treatment 3 and control. We'll follow this format consistently for all the findings presented. The effects are positive, arguably not large. The control arm already seems to have a respectable knowledge of IYCF practices of 8 relative to our score of maximum score. We then shift to the probability that the infant is achieving a minimum acceptable diet at midline. So as noted, these children are aged 6 to 23 months. This is a prime age for the introduction of complementary foods, but as is widely known, late or inappropriate introduction of complementary foods is a significant challenge. We can see here in the control arm T1, not even 10% of children are reported to achieve MAD. This is slightly higher in T2 at 11%, but that difference is not significant. It is dramatically higher in T3 at 22%. So the rate has more than doubled. Again, the treatment effects are reported above. This suggests that the introduction of the maternal cash transfer as well as BCC is required for households to improve infant and young child feeding practices. Stunting prevalence, we see that stunting is increasing over time. That's consistent with patterns of growth faltering that are observed in this population as children are aging from 6 to 23 months to 24 to 28 months, they're more likely to be stunted. In this graph, we do not see any variation across T1, T2, T3, but we will come back to this when we discuss heterogeneity with respect to livelihood grants, and we'll see meaningful variation there. The CREDI is a measure of early childhood development beyond simply linear growth. This captures whether children are achieving developmental milestones, beginning to crawl, to talk, to walk as appropriate for their age. And here we see positive treatment effects, again, only in the third treatment arm that also provided maternal cash transfers at both midline for the younger children and at endline. So this is highly consistent with the findings for a minimum adequate diet. It seems that the conjunction of the nurturing care groups and maternal cash transfers are required to generate gains. Let me just briefly summarize. We see that behavioral change communication alone is improving knowledge, but not feeding practices or growth. T3, with the addition of maternal cash transfers, is generating broad improvements in child nutrition and development, does not reduce stunting. We didn't show these findings, but the shifts in dietary diversity and minimum adequate diet are driven by increased consumption of animal source foods. And as I noted, we will come back to effects on height for age and stunting shortly. Before we do, let me describe some household level livelihoods outcomes. So up to now, I've showed nutritional outcomes for children only. This is the household dietary diversity score, capturing the overall quality of food consumption at the household level. We can see at midline, there are positive treatment effects, larger and significant only in the third treatment arm. By endline, we see significant and positive effects in both treatment arms, suggesting that all household members are experiencing some improvement in their diet linked to participation in SPIR II. Per capita consumption, here we are capturing total consumption per capita in dollars adjusted for purchasing power parity. The trend over time, the blue line in T1, it's important to note, is weakly negative. So households are experiencing some decline in consumption linked to the challenging environment in rural Ethiopia in this period. But we do see positive effects linked to SPIR II. Here, they're again concentrated in T3. The effect is 12 cents at midline and 15 cents at endline. The effects in T2 are weakly positive, but not significant. So this is also associated with a difference in the poverty rate. Again, the blue line here for the control arm is slightly increasing. So conditions are deteriorating for the control households, but among households participating in SPIR, we do see lower rates of poverty. By endline, that is actually significant in both arms, 3 percentage points in the second treatment arm and 6 in the third treatment arm. Tropical livestock units is a measure of assets. We see, again, positive treatment effects at endline for both arms, but notably larger in T3. Again, for control households, their asset stock is weakly declining. And the probability of reporting formal savings increases dramatically. This is consistent with FESA participation. By endline, households in both arms are about 20 percentage points more likely to report that they have any formal savings. Earlier, we showed treatment effects associated with livestock. So accumulation of livestock is by far the most common livelihoods activities for these households, and consistent with the accumulation of livestock, they also report more income linked to livestock in both T2 and T3. This is annual net livestock income. So this higher income stream is part of what's sustaining the gains that we see in consumption and food security. To sum up, we see that T3 is generating large and sustained positive effects in a context in which outcomes are deteriorating in the control arm, and that includes positive effects on consumption, livestock, financial inclusion. The effects in T2 are generally positive but smaller and are not observed for consumption or poverty. Let me now pass it to Kale. He's going to discuss the final set of findings.
Great. Thank you, Jessica. So we'll be talking about now about this heterogeneous effects of when we break these treatment arms into those that received the livelihood grant, which is about $300, and those who did not. So the graphs that I'll present are a little bit different than those that Jessica presented. So here we have on the horizontal axis the difference to the control group. So and then on the vertical axis we have these different subgroups. So this graph presents the impacts on child stunting. So the underlying indicator is height for age set score, and if a child is considered stunted if their height for age set score is less than -2 standard deviations. And if we look at the impacts on height for age set scores, the effects are the largest effects are about 0.2 standard deviation reduction in height for age set score, and this effect is highly significant. So here we focus on stunting. If we look at the end line results here, we see that the negative effects on stunting are concentrated on those households that receive those livelihood grants. So in T2 and T2 households that receive the grants, so behavioral change communication and grant, livelihood grant, and T3, which is the behavioral change communication SPIR and maternal cash transfers and the livelihood grant, we see almost a 7 percentage point drop in the probability of stunting. And in the T2 grants, it's about 6 percentage points, but that's not statistically significant. Next slide, please. Here we present similar kind of corresponding results for per capita consumption. And per capita consumption, as you know, is a kind of an underlying indicator when we calculate poverty rates. Here we see quite substantial effects on, again, this time focused on those households that received the maternal cash transfers in the T3 arm, with the largest effect in the group that received both maternal cash transfers and livelihood grants. So the effect here is we're talking about purchasing power parity dollars per day per person, so about 21 cents international dollars per day per person. And this may sound like a small amount, but compared to the control, we're talking about the 13% increase in consumption. Next slide, please. Then we move on to cost-benefit analysis, which is kind of an important component of this evaluation. We're asking the question whether these benefits that we observe in these treatment arms, do they justify its cost? So here we compare the total program costs per households against the discounted stream of future consumption gains. We consider the costs that include the graduation programming, the maternal cash transfers, and the livelihood grants. But as you remember, all of these households, including the control, receive the PSNP, so we exclude the cost of PSNP from this calculation. So we're basically looking at the marginal changes in costs across treatment arms relative to the control arm. We use the estimated the coefficients that we estimate the treatment effects on household consumption, and then we annualize them and project forward. A benefit cost ratio of larger than 1 means that the program generates more in benefits than its costs, and this is kind of the benchmark that we look at. Next slide, please. So here are the costs. So these are again in purchasing power parity dollars. So they adjust for kind of price differences across countries and facilitate international comparison, but they might not be so meaningful for international donor, for example, working with USD-based budgets. So here the core graduation programming, the SPIR with the behavioral change communication, it costed 163 PPP dollars. Or if we convert this to nominal US dollars, it's about 90 USD per household. Then when we add these maternal cash transfers, the cost increases substantially to almost 1,000 PPP dollars. And then when we add everything, maternal cash transfer and the livelihood grant, we're talking about 1,455 PPP dollars, and that's about 870 nominal USD per household. There are various ways of doing these calculations when we move to the cost-benefit analysis. We need to make some assumptions of how long these gains that we observe persist, and what's the kind of the horizon that we're looking at here. So we selected here for this presentation a 10-year horizon with a 10% annual decay from the end line onwards, which is the year 3 levels. And then we use the World Bank guidelines of discount rate 5% per year. We don't, in this presentation, include the kind of intergenerational benefits that come from improved child nutrition, but we do include those in the manuscript, the research manuscript that we have prepared. And there we also vary these assumptions to, and we compare to other literature. Next slide, please. So here in this slide, we show the cost-benefit ratios for consumption for those two subgroups in the T3 arm. That's where we saw these positive effects on consumption, and those are shown with the blue bars here, and they are about 2. So basically, the benefit cost ratio is about 2, and this means that if you invest $1, you get 2 back, which is a very, very good benefit cost ratio. And the other bars here are from evaluations and programs that have been implemented elsewhere in Bangladesh, India, Ethiopia, other one in Ethiopia, Pakistan, Peru, and Ghana, and Niger and Afghanistan. So these are major programs as well that have been evaluated prior to the study, and we can calculate the cost-benefit ratios for them following the same assumption and approach that we do. And we see here that the SPIR T3 arm compares quite favorably in this literature, is among the best benefit cost ratios that we observe across this literature. Next slide, please. So basically, the program more than pays for itself under conservative assumptions, and as I said, it's comparable to the most cost-effective graduation programs in the literature. But the important thing here is that these consumption effects focus on this group that received maternal cash transfers, and we don't see effects on the groups that did not receive maternal cash transfers. Next slide, please. So moving on to conclusions, behavioral change communication with sufficient financial resources generate large, sustained improvements across livelihood and nutrition outcomes. Improving infant and young child feeding knowledge is necessary, but it's not sufficient. Households just cannot afford to purchase some of these complementary foods without the maternal cash transfers or the livelihood support. The anthropometric outcomes, the effects on anthropometric outcomes only emerge when the full package is received by the poorest household. So this includes the SPIR livelihood programming, behavioral change communication, maternal cash transfers, and the livelihood grants. These effects grow or remain stable over time, so it kind of improves the durable productive capacity of these households. And as I said, the benefit cost ratios of 2 is excellent. The program more than pays for itself with dual livelihood and nutrition returns. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. I think we have a couple questions that came in. So I'm just going to ask, I think maybe Jessica, you might be the first one as you spoke a little bit about the livelihoods outcomes. So I think I'm just going to ask, how are you evaluating the concept of sustained livelihoods outcomes?
Sure. So in considering sustained livelihoods outcomes, I think there are a few components. First, we consider whether we see consistent effects across multiple livelihoods indicators. I showed some of that in my presentation, but if with a long discussion, you could see that the effects, particularly in T3, are quite consistent. So we see higher income, higher assets, higher financial inclusion, improved consumption. And it is consistent with our interpretation that, as Kale said, there's been a shift in the underlying productive capacity, not just use of transfers. There's also the point that the transfers themselves have concluded at least 6 months prior to the inline. We can also look at trends over time. As we saw in some of the graphs presented, the treatment effects are consistently growing from midline to endline. That's a roughly 2-year period, suggesting that households are building on earlier gains, not merely drawing down an existing stock of resources. So those findings are very encouraging. That being said, of course, for truly evidence about truly sustained outcomes, we would need a longer term follow-up. In our cost benefit analysis, we are making assumptions about how these effects will evolve over time. We have used various assumptions in which the effects start to decline, as noted, like a 10% decay each year. And the benefits are so large that even assuming the effects start to decline at some point, generally you would still conclude that the benefits exceed the costs. But of course, that does depend on how the effects evolve from this point forward.
Thanks, Jessica. Just kind of following up on this and looking at the sustained livelihoods, was natural resource management and watershed management activities impact also considered on that?
And that's a great question. In this trial, largely not. And the reason for that is that the variation in NRM or watershed management activities was largely orthogonal to the activities implemented here and varied at a higher level since watersheds often encompass multiple local kabeles, and our randomization was at the kabele level. We did have another trial implemented joint with the SPIR II team that specifically focused on questions related to sustainable land management or climate smart agriculture, which, while not quite the same as NRM, kind of falls under that broad umbrella. But in this trial, we don't have much evidence that's so relevant to that programming. Julia, you're muted.
Jessica, sorry. Sorry about that. This is maybe, yes. Okay, here's another one, which may be a little bit more interesting to answer. But given the strong returns shown for the full package approach, what do these findings suggest for future programming? If you were to take a top 1 or 2 kind of key findings, takeaway.
Yeah, maybe I can try to chime in.
Sure.
Yeah, this is a very good question, particularly in the kind of in the climate where we are in Ethiopia, where there's constrained budgets and so forth. So I've been working in this space in Ethiopia and this for a long time, more than a decade now, and it's been very, very rare to see that children's anthropometric outcomes, chronic undernutrition is moving in these types of evaluations. And here we finally see these positive effects, encouraging effects, but it's only when these households receive quite a substantial financial supports. So in that sense, if we want to improve child stunting in this context, with these types of interventions, we need to ensure that ultra-poor households do receive sufficient resources to be able to support their children's growth, purchase the nutritious foods, and support their health outcomes and so forth. So in that sense, I don't think there's a shortcut based on these types of based on the evidence that we provided here.
Thanks, Kali. I see Arif. Do you have a hand if you wanted to come off mute?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Jessica and Kel, for your wonderful presentation. I do have two questions. One is, while in this particular project, we have seen that behavior change communication on IYCF combined with maternal cash grant makes a huge difference. While we also know that majority of the programs don't have maternal cash grant component, and we have been using just purely behavior change communication in many projects, if not majority of the project. So IFPRI being a food policy research organization, based on the findings, what you are planning to do? That's one. Second question is how these results can be used in a humanitarian assistance type project. This is a more development project or developmental type project. How these results can be used in a more humanitarian assistance type project. Over.
Great, thanks for those questions. Dan, would you like to jump in, or would you like me to continue?
Hi, Jessica. Thanks. I'll come in. Thank you. I'll come in for a second, but please follow up as well. Arif, these are good questions, and it relates to the prior question as well. What we're finding, and as Kale said very well, these are quite unique results for Ethiopia. This is really among the first examples we've seen among targeted programs like the PSNP, even when supplemented with BCC, we're generally not finding effects. We find learning effects often among mothers, right? And their kind of caring behaviors and feeding behaviors can improve, but we don't see effects that go all the way out to anthropometry or child growth. And here we have that, but it's driven very much by both the combination of the livelihood transfer and the maternal grants. And so I consider this a really important result. It's consistent with some evidence from other IFPRI work and other work that it's kind of that nutrition behavior change communication is a really important ingredient, but for it to have large effects in improving child growth outcomes for poor households, for ultra poor households, you really need to relieve the cash constraint too. You need to get mothers and families access to much larger resources. So I think that's the takeaway, and it's one that we see evidence like this across several studies. And so I think it's an important question, as Kali kind of previewed, for government Ethiopia right now as they're considering changes to the PSNP, for Department of State as they're considering sort of investments in new programs. I think, how do we think about that then? And do we want to, here we're talking about targeted transfers to the poorest households. So in this case, the livelihood grants were not given sort of, they were given only to the poorest third of households. So I think it's worth thinking very hard about targeting and how to combine these programs effectively to achieve those child nutrition outcomes. Thanks.
Great, and I'll just add in terms of the question about humanitarian settings, I think this type of programming is broadly relevant for a range of settings, including humanitarian contexts. So these key program elements, cash transfers, savings groups, BCC are widely delivered in humanitarian settings as well. And we at IFPRI have also conducted similar projects, perhaps less complex and multifaceted than this, but similar projects in humanitarian settings, for example, Yemen, Sudan, etc. So these findings should certainly not be considered to be unique to a more developmental context.
Maybe I can add one more thing about humanitarian aspect. So we evaluated the first phase of this program, and we did a study there using that evaluation where we found that the SPIR phase 1 program actually protected households against droughts. And and you can then think about the context of global warming, where these types of extreme weather events are likely to become more frequent and perhaps more severe. So maybe investments like this might actually support the humanitarian and sector as well in terms of reducing the future caseloads as well. And I'd really like to see the research aspect moving into this direction and try to think very hard on these kinds of cost benefit analysis in this type of arena as well, whether large one-off investments can kind of reduce future caseload and suffering during droughts.
Great. Thanks, Jessica and Kali. There's a couple more that have come in on the Q&A function. So one is kind of a two-part question, so kind of apologies for that. So the first is, do you have any thoughts about the midline findings regarding stunting treatment effects, particularly in T3 comparing grant to no grant? And in specifically, stunting reduction effect of grants within T3 seemed greater at endline. So kind of what's the difference between midline findings? So I'm not sure, Jessica, I think there was a slide on that.
Sure. Carla, do you want to answer that one actually?
Yeah, I can. So just kind of as a background, we designed this study so that we would, in the midline, focus on infant and young child feeding practices, particularly dietary diversity, which has been a long time a real constraint in Ethiopia, very low dietary diversity among children. And the theory of change was that we would like to see improvements in caregivers' knowledge of infant and young child feeding practices. And then that knowledge, potentially paired with cash transfers, would improve dietary diversity and infant and young child feeding outcomes more broadly. And then once we move to the end line, we would see if everything works well, we might see improvements in child growth outcomes, reductions in chronic undernutrition. So the way we set up this study was that to understand the impacts on chronic undernutrition, end line would be that primary outcome, primary survey round in which we measure them. So if we look at the kind of typical stunting or growth faltering patterns in Ethiopia and in any other low and middle income countries, you see that the growth faltering occurs in the first 1,000 days, which starts from conceptions until the child's second birthday. So it's really the best time to measure the final kind of impact, if you like, is after the first 1,000 days. So in that sense, I wouldn't focus too much on the midline results when it comes to height, weight, set score, and stunting. So that's kind of one aspect to it. And the other aspect is that we do see that these households invest in productive activities, and we see improvements in consumption outcomes to grow over time. And these are focused on the livelihood, on the maternal cash transfer households. And so it could be that this income effect start kicking also later, and that's why we see this different effects at the end line. Jessica, feel free to add if you have something.
Yeah, and just kind of following on and looking at the grant eligibility, was that based on only baseline characteristics, or was that assessed periodically or annually?
That was only based on asset levels at baseline. It was not revised afterwards.
Okay, great. Thanks. Oh, Jessica, did you want to come on? Sorry,
I was just going to know, and for this sample, there was only one round of grants, so they were not dispersed more than once.
Great. I just see, and apologies as they come in, so I'm just kind of taking them as they come in. So just thinking here, given the limited variation in nutrition knowledge across the groups, it seemed like household ability to apply knowledge was primarily a financial barrier. Is that your interpretation?
Yeah, that's a great point. I think that is a plausible interpretation of these findings. There are a couple of caveats. One is that our measure of knowledge, of course, is imperfect. And in particular, the fact that even the households in the control arm knew the answers to most of our questions suggests perhaps they were somewhat easy. So there could have been gains in knowledge on other topics that we didn't capture. There can also, of course, be other dimensions of gains from participating in the nurturing care groups, particularly given its peer dimension. So gains in motivation, in the salience of infant and young child feeding practices that are hard to capture. So we can't interpret these that the NCGs didn't make a difference, but it does seem clear that there are very hard financial constraints that's consistent with a lot of other evidence from other evaluations, from our formative work. And so alleviating those financial constraints via the maternal cash transfer seems to be quite key in enabling households to shift behaviors. I'll just briefly note, even beyond feeding behaviors, we also collected data on parental stimulation behaviors, which is essentially interacting with your young child. Do you sing? Do you play, etc.? Now, those actions are somewhat free essentially when you do them. But of course, these households also face tight time constraints linked to their income generation challenges. And so for stimulation practices, we also saw those practices benefit more in the arm, including maternal cash transfers, suggesting that even for inputs that don't require a cash outlay, they're better able to invest in their child when they have the additional financial resources that's alleviating some of the constraints that they face.
Thanks, Jessica. This is looking also kind of at constraints also, but many of the outcomes were looking at household level indicators. But did you have any findings related to intra-household dynamics? So for example, women's economic empowerment or male engagement in caregiving?
Sure, I can answer that as well. We didn't discuss this today, but we do see gains in male engagement and caregiving, so more reported maternal activity. We also measured men's knowledge about IICF at N9, and we also see gains among men's knowledge, even though men did not participate in the nurturing care groups. They seem to be absorbing some of the information. Again, the knowledge gains do not seem to be large. In terms of women's economic empowerment, we see the reported gains in savings, for example, are roughly symmetric if you ask men or women. Now, men and women generally participate and invest this together. That's one of the programmatic emphases of SPIR II. So that's consistent with joint participation. We don't see any meaningful outcomes in which women are gaining more than men. So in an absolute sense, both spouses seem to be participating in the new economic activities, but that's symmetric.
Thanks, Jessica. I'm also kind of putting you on the spot here, so apologies for this. What do you make of the seemingly limited variation of the cost-benefit analysis between T3 grant and T3 no grant? I'm not sure if that's you or Kale, maybe.
Maybe I can take that. So there's when we do this benefit cost analysis, there's variation in two fronts. One is the cost aspect, and the other one is the effects. So if I remember correctly, I should actually look at here from my slides. Yeah, so within T3 arm, the no grant effect is slightly smaller than the effect on the T3 grant. So basically, the somewhat less costly group achieved slightly smaller effect sizes. So basically, the effects are larger when we look at the costlier option. So that basically they kind of cancel out, if you like, these two effects. So in that sense, the both achieve the same benefit cost ratios, but the costs are different and the effects are different. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but I think it's an interesting point, and then one can start to think about if we would scale this up, which aspects, which intervention would you actually scale up?
Thanks, Kale. I think I'm just looking through another one. I think another one that came in is Yeah, I'm not sure if we have this, but did you look at the quality of the nurturing care group intervention? Specifically, I am wondering if the intervention included content to specifically address financial barriers, limitations, and encourage behavior change, or if it was more focused on knowledge. I'm not sure if that's you or that would be maybe World Vision.
Sure. So I will give a brief answer, and if
Sure.
anyone from World Vision wants to jump in, that would certainly be more than welcome. So we did assess fidelity of implementation of the nurturing care groups in terms of whether households are reporting that they're aware of it, did they participate, how often did they attend, etc. And we see very high levels of participation. That's notable in particular because the rollout of the nurturing care groups was motivated in part by the fact that in previous nutrition programming in SPIR I, a different model was used that was more dependent on health extension workers. And there we saw quite low levels of penetration. So many women weren't participating in BCC or weren't reached. Here we see that's not the case. In terms of the NCG curriculum, as to whether it points at addressing financial constraints, it does include a range of topics, as I noted, but a substantial element is the appropriate introduction of complementary foods. And those either have to be purchased or even if the household is producing those foods, entails diverting those foods to child consumption rather to some other purpose rather than having an adult consume them or rather than having them be sold. So in that sense, it is prompting households to invest more resources in infant and young child feeding beyond just knowledge. But whether they are able to do so, of course, depends on their underlying resources. And as we discussed earlier, the evidence seems to suggest that in T2, without the maternal cash transfers, many households are not able to implement those recommendations, even though they seem to be aware of them.
Thanks. Thanks, Jessica. And I'm not sure if anybody else from World Vision wanted to add, but if I don't see a hand, I will just continue. And with questions here. And this is maybe more for World Vision. Maybe you know a little bit, Jessica, but if not, that's fine. This is kind of looking at the implementation of the nurturing care group model. What's the kind of involvement of community health workers? Is there a number of sessions dedicated to ECD versus IYCF? You know, what's more information on what's exactly included on the as part of the nurturing care group model. So that might not be you, Jessica. Welcome. If World Vision has any thoughts, please feel free to kind of put your hand up and come off mute, or we can address this at a later time. Okay.
Yeah, I can just very briefly note the health extension workers are stakeholders in the implementation of nurturing care groups, so they participate in the cascaded model, but they're not the frontline workers managing the groups or conducting the behavioral change counseling. And again, that was partly driven by the observation in previous studies that they have a large number of responsibilities and find it hard to implement intensive BCC. In terms of the division of sessions, I think the curriculum is publicly available, but ECD is a distinct minority of the sessions. It might be 2 out of a year or 4 out of a year. So the majority is infant and young child feeding and also other topics related to childbirth and kind of early infancy.
Great. Thanks, Jessica. A couple more. I realize we have 5 minutes, so I will take 2 more questions. The first one is kind of, what is the yearly income of the targeted population in comparison to the size of the grants received? Do we have any comparison there?
The maternal cash transfer is about 15% of baseline consumption.
Thanks. Oh, and there's a couple of ones that are coming in. So here's another one. Did the evaluation look into households that accessed additional finance in the form of loans and the extent to which there were influences in livelihood outcomes besides the grants?
Sure, we do see treatment effects on credit. We didn't describe those in the presentation, but households are more likely to report that they're accessing credit. That's consistent with our findings from this PSNP I intervention. As to the extent to which that shapes livelihoods outcomes, challenging to assess. the effects on credit, while positive, are not large in absolute terms. I think the gain and the probability of reporting credit is between 5 and 10 percentage points. Most households are not reporting access to credit, but still, it's hard to assess exactly how important that is. It is certainly part of the pattern we see.
And one last question, kind of if we have kind of a number here, but based on this study, what would be a recommended size of livelihood grants to make meaningful transition in the livelihoods of households? Not sure we can answer that.
It's difficult to put into like a specific number here, but I think this question comes at the background of the PSNP design for the next phase, which has a big graduation focus here. So based on this study and also earlier studies, it seems that maybe $200 or $300 livelihood grant is not sufficient to kind of push the needle, if you like, when it comes to these livelihood outcomes. I think the kind of safe answer is that it probably should be a larger amount. But I think it's also good to see to understand that when we start to see these effects on livelihood outcomes, it's when these households receive the maternal cash transfer, which is a monthly transfer of about $20 per household, and large effects when these maternal cash transfers are combined with the livelihood grant. So then translating this into the context of the PSNP, so maybe the PSNP transfers themselves are not kind of large enough for the households to kind of to stabilize consumption, and maybe kind of addressing that constraint first is important before we start thinking about graduation interventions embedded into the PSNP.
Great, thanks. Well, I really appreciate everybody's questions and comments. I think that's pretty much, we've answered most of them. I think there's one last, which is how benefits are measured in this project. So I don't know if Jessica or other people want to kind of add into that one.
Sure. So in the findings that we showed today, we're measuring benefits using the gains in household consumption that we have estimated, and then we're making various assumptions about how these gains persist or evolve over time. So we are not explicitly taking into account gains along other dimensions. So increased assets or better child stimulation, et cetera. We're focusing on consumption. We do have, as Kale alluded to, another analysis, a supplementary analysis, where we also estimate the benefits to the child who is less stunted today in terms of his or her future increased earnings as a result of better health status. And those effects are positive, but they are actually not large relative to the gains in consumption, primarily because they're far in the future, right? So the child is still only 2 to 4 today, so future earning gains are not for nearly 20 years. But we do have a detailed discussion of that in the paper, and I posted the link in response to another question.
Great, thanks. So I do realize we're kind of at the close of the hour at 9:59, so Eastern time. I realize it's end of the afternoon in Ethiopia. I just wanted to thank everybody for their time, their participation. Thanks especially IFPRI, Jessica and the IFPRI team for doing this. We will share out the recording and the slides after this presentation with the larger group, so everybody has access. Thanks also, Arif. We appreciate your time and help on this, and have a good rest of your day. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Julia, and the IMPEL team, as well as our Save the Children colleagues, and Dan, Jessica, and Kale for your presentation and doing this very important research work. Thank you.